Hi all, today we have to discuss one feature of Spring Boot, that is lazy initialization. We have to discuss about the advantage and disadvantage of this feature, and as well as we'll do a small hands-on. So now what is lazy initialization of Spring Boot? Lazy initialization allows Spring application to initialize the application lazily. What does it means? It means that Spring application will not be initialized fully at the time of startup. In general, what Spring application does, Spring application checks as a part of auto configuration or component scan, it checks all the bins whatever are present in our application. Those bins are required or not required at the time of startup, but the Spring application creates all the instance of the bin and stores into the JVM. So it may happen at the time of startup that all the created memory may not fit into the allocated JVM memory. So at the startup, JVM sometimes that Spring application may throw that exception that out of memory. And also the one advantage is this also, that if there is some issue in the bin creation, we get that exception at the time of startup. So we don't need to wait once the request will come for that bin. Now the lazy initialization saying that okay, Spring application will not create all the bins. It will check only those configuration, only those bins which are applicable at the time of startup, and that other bins will be created on demand. Means once the request come for that corresponding bin, that bin will be created. So advantage of lazy initialization is that the startup time for the Spring Boot will be fast. So because it is not creating all the bins, so it is creating all the required bins at the time of startup, so that application will run at very fast. Now what is the downside or disadvantage of this feature? Disadvantage of this feature is that let's say that there is some problem in the bin creation, and that bin was not required at the time of startup, so it didn't catch that exception at the time of startup. And once the corresponding request will come for that bin, and Spring application or boot will try to create that bin, it will get that exception. So the exception may come at the time of request, at the time of runtime, that okay, that means there is some problem in that exception. And another problem may happen that there is a memory issue. It may have, as in the lazy initialization we are allocating the bins on demand or creating the bins based on request. It may happen that at certain times all the bins are not fit into that memory, and we may get that okay, out of memory issue. So that may come at any time if there is some problem in the memory issue. These are the two disadvantage. And advantage, as I mentioned, that the startup time is very fast. So now the question is that when we have to do that lazy initialization. So before implementing this feature, the architect or developer who is managing the system has to check the JVM memory fine has to check that memory fine tuning very well first, and second is that has a very good analysis about all the bins, such that we should not get any exception at runtime. So first is that memory fine tuning should be done very well, and second is that all the bin configuration has to be checked very well, such that we don't get any surprise at the time of request. Now we have to do one small
We
hands-on
have to do
for
one
this
small hands-on about
lazy
lazy
initialization.
initialization, how it works. So we have one small application, that is the employee application, as a Spring Boot application class. It has one main method. It has one method which is exposed by get employee, that is hard coded, that my name is Tom. And now we have another controller class, that is the employee controller. See, in this controller, if you see, we have one service class, that is auto award, means that in general this instance will be created once that server will start, if we do not use any lazy initialization. Because if you see, this employee service is not required at the time of Spring Boot employee application, right? It is not required. So in general, once it starts the application, it will try to create this instance, and this service we are using in that corresponding simple one method, that is the service.getEmployee. But if I go to my service, if we see, by intention I have thrown some exception, been not found exception at the time of constructor. Okay, in general, what it would do, once we have to start the application, it should throw some exception if we do not use any lazy initialization. That we have to check at very beginning. If we run the application, run as Spring Boot app, see, this is giving the message there is a problem to instantiate the bean employee service, and the action is that please check the constructor of the bean. That message is coming as we have discussed in our one of a video about the failure in analyzer, that is the bean not found failure analyzer, that is giving the message. So that is a custom message we are getting. But anyway, the exception is happening at the time of server startup. Now what we will do, we have to use that lazy initialization. How we can make it? First we have to create this Spring Boot Spring application. Let's say application equal to new Spring application, new Spring application. We will create that, we'll customize the Spring application, and we'll say, hey, take this class, yeah, and this application will run with arguments, right? This is the way also we can run our Spring app. So before running, what we have to do, we have to set that, hey, set lazy initialization as true. So I'm configuring the Spring Boot application to use the lazy initialization before running the application. Now if I run my application, what we will see, I should not get that exception. Why? Because that employee service is not used at the time of startup. So that service we are using to a specific request. Now let's start the application, and the corresponding exception should not happen. It will see, without throwing any exception, the application has started very smoothly and very fast. Now what will happen, once we will check that corresponding get employee details mapping, because at the time of get employee details, the Spring Boot application will try to instantiate this service, and it should get some exception because we have explicitly thrown that exception. Now if I go and check it, localhost, yeah, see, it is not giving that corresponding message. And if we check our console, what will get, that exception message, that yeah, this is the employee service, the bean not found exception. We are getting this corresponding bean not found exception. So it means that the exception for that bean we are getting at the time of request, not at the time of server startup. So I hope you have understood the advantage and disadvantage. So the startup time was very fast without giving any exception, but the exception is coming based on that request. So once we have to do the lazy initialization, we should be very careful about all the bean configuration as well as memory profiling, that how much total memory may be required at the peak request and whether my JVM has that corresponding allocated memory or not. So based on that, we should take the decision whether I have to use the lazy initialization or not. So that's all for the lazy initialization, and once we have to get chance and we will do the fine tuning for the memory profiling and the bean configuration, you may use the lazy initialization, but be very careful to implement it. Yeah, that's all for this video. Thank you all.